All right, so last week we got the welcome news that the price of fuel will be decreasing by R1.50 a litre. That is for petrol and diesel, due to a cut in the fuel levy that comes in to force on Wednesday. And of course, that's a tax cushion to help get us through a series of expected price increases due to the global instability of the crude oil price. And of course, we've heard about the increases just this evening. But from June, a new series of measures to cut the price of petrol and diesel will be tabled. Among those measures, a plan to deregulate the price of 93-octane petrol. In other words, the start of competitive pricing. And I'm joined now by Peter Morgan, CEO of the Liquid Fuel Wholesalers Association. Now, their key focus is to lobby, advise and advocate on matters relating to the fuel industry. Peter, thank you so much for your time. So let's start short term. So this week we are seeing petrol is up between 28 and 36 cents a litre. Obviously, it would have been much higher if not for that tax cushion. It would have been around 180. But diesel, even with that tax cushion, is going up by, I think, over R1.60. Why is diesel so high? Is it because it's used for heating?
Yeah, you see, in fact, there's two different diesel increases because we have two different diesels that have a different amount of sulfur in. So it is about R1.60, but there are two different diesels and there's two different increases. If you look at why the price is changing, it's really all about globally because of COVID, and most economies slowed down. If you look at COVID now disappearing, a lot of the global economies are starting to heat up again. And if you look at the fuel price, you'll see that there's really three elements. There's taxes and levies that has been spoken about, and hence the R1.50 deduction in the fuel tax. Then there's also what we call administered prices, and that's all the cost recoveries and all the margins. And that's wholesale margins, secondary storage, secondary distribution, the retailer's margin, and that makes up about R3 of the fuel price. And then the balance, the big chunk of the fuel price, there's that element called the basic fuel price. So what you see is that when they talk about, the economy starting to take off again, a lot of that basic fuel price is what would it cost us to import a litre of diesel if we didn't have refineries. Let's forget that we currently don't have refineries. We have mostly imported. So what you find is that when people started to place orders in the global market for diesel and for petrol, the shortage in the diesel market globally was probably a lot more stringent. And that's why the price that you have to pay for it is actually higher than you expected. And I believe that that's where these extra prices are coming from. Okay. It's just the fact that, we're trying to order it. And the first time you order it, there isn't any. And that changes the dynamics of the finished products globally. It's a global issue.
So it's a bit of a supply and demand thing around diesel specifically. Let's talk about this plan from June. You spoke about the taxes and levies, the administrative prices, which is all to do with the margins, and then, of course, the basic fuel price, which you have very little control over. It does look like the Department of Mineral and Energies is looking at the margins. I want to speak to you about the wholesale margin. Can it go down? Do you think that it's something that should and could be looked at?
You see, if we look at how these administered prices are done, they're actually done through a process that we call regulatory margin model guidelines. And what it really means is that the wholesale margin, that's both for petrol and diesel because they're very different. The secondary storage and distribution, all those are actually done once a year, and they are in cents per litre. So these administered prices either go up or down, because they do come down sometimes, once a year in cents a litre. Okay? But if you talk to independent wholesalers and you talk to retailers, okay, the first issue is that when the pump price goes up like it has been, it's not the independent wholesalers and it's not fuel retailers that are getting the additional benefit. Their numbers don't change unless the annual regulatory margin adjustment comes into place. So for retailers and for wholesalers, our risks are really not about price changes. Our risks are about this thing that's now been talked about that says, let's have some form of gentle deregulation. We think that's where the problems are.
Okay, talk to me about deregulation. We know that 93 octane is where it's going to start. There are plans to cap 93 octane at a certain level, which means those who want to compete can come into the market at a lower level. The Finance Minister, Enoch Godongwana, is saying this is a step towards ultimately fully deregulating fuel. Are you in favour of deregulation? Do you share some of the concerns of the fuel retailers who say this might actually squeeze out some of the emerging black retailers?
Yeah, you see, it's very interesting. Because when a member of the LFWA says to me, let's talk deregulation, I say to them, you can actually have a look on the internet globally. There are some exceptionally good studies that have been done, and in particular in New Zealand and in Australia, that will tell you what happens when you deregulate. Because Australia actually tried to deregulate that's being suggested now, and it didn't work, and they had to go back and deregulate properly. So I think your opening comment said that if you're allowed to discount 93, that will allow others to come into the market easier. I'm afraid I don't think that's the case.
No, what I mean
because
is
deregulation,
those who are able to compete. So, for example, let's say a Pick and Pay decides to sell cheaper fuel. You know, they could do that, but not everyone would have that capacity. That's the point I was trying to make. Continue.
Actually, that's a very good point, because if you look at the New Zealand scenario, there was a lot of what actually happened by the Pick and Pay or the Woolworths of New Zealand. So what the point you made is a very, very good one. You know, we're saying that you either have to deregulate properly or you have to leave it as it is now until such time as this country is ready for it. But when we talk about deregulation, we have to understand that if you look at what happened globally in most areas, the ones we've studied, that what you find is that there is some efficiency benefits. And what that really means is you have less service stations, but those service stations have bigger volumes, which means that the retailer can make as much money as he was. But that also means there's going to be a lot less service stations. And in our instance, probably a lot less independent wholesalers. So we cannot ignore in South Africa, and most other countries don't have the situation we have. But when you start talking about a lot less service stations, in South Africa, there's two very important issues. In our current secondary distribution and secondary storage model, there is a deliberate cross-subsidy that says you pay the same for secondary distribution and for secondary storage in urban areas as you do in non-urban areas. And that's done deliberately to keep the price of fuel down in the non-urban areas. So if you deregulate, that's going to change. The price of fuel may come down in urban areas because there's a slight over-recovery in those numbers. But it will, in all likelihood, go up in the non-urban areas. However, at the same time, we find that if you have non-urban areas that are within a 30, 40, 50-kilometer radius of urban areas, then you shift all the volume away from those areas into the towns,
right,
where people are filling up. And instead, it changes their buying pattern. But there's one other issue. We start talking about less service stations, and we also have to start talking about the fact that we have to have self-service.
Yeah, so
and
less, I'm with you. I'm going to just
65,000.
Yeah, and that's been a big thorny issue. Sorry to jump in there, but we are out of time. Less service stations, then we talk about self-service, then we talk about losing jobs with petrol attendants. And that is a massive, massive issue. These things need to be discussed. Thank you so much for starting off the conversation for us. Peter Morgan, CEO of the Liquid Fuel Wholesalers Association.